You see kind of media statements and things going on. Yeah.
Okay, it's 5 o'clock. I'm going to give people another 2 minutes and then introduce Vikas, and then he can do it. While we're waiting for add to this ad break. So the UCT has a program called the Management of Infrastructure Reform that's been running for about 15, 20 years. They've trained hundreds of energy regulators through Africa. The person that runs it, his name is Professor Anton Eberhardt. Somebody told me they read his book on renewable energy that he wrote in 1987. It was Sue Rosemary. Between the Energy Research Centre that I work with and the GSB that I've also worked with, in my view, this is my opinion, so this is an advert, okay? It's got nothing to do with anything else I'm doing here. The Energy Research Centre and the Graduate School of Business, and partly recently the CSIR Energy Group, they sort of stand as national assets between very, very powerful energy interests that own big coal mines and things, and a very contested national debate. And these two centres at UCT, I think, are kind of the voice of high quality, independent research and reason. So just this Energy Futures thing that was up there, just the people that organized spent about a year researching what was going on, and they provided the main to the Eskom inquiry in Parliament. I don't know if any of you watched. So that they do this almost as a work of love. They don't get paid very much to do it. Most of them are students and things. And they're really standing between, sometimes between what could really be crazy nuclear programs and investments that go down the drain. And they provide the only kind of independent information in South Africa in a very, very contested space. So, yeah. Here tomorrow because this is the course I'm convening. So please come. Sign up for this. That's free.
Yes.
So
there will be snacks too.
You can compare notes. Okay. So just hearing. Okay, so Vikas is, I've known him for quite a while, but I'll just make these notes quickly. He's a junior research fellow at this GSB MIR and a PhD candidate. And his research that he's doing focuses on independent power producer, IPP. You'll hear that word a lot now in his lecture, I think, and emerging power investments in Africa. And he focuses on renewable energy and energy access, and he can tell you what those means. He also worked at the Energy Research Centre for a while, and before that, for many years, he was a consultant at some big, fancy consultancies. He looks young.
Thank you, Hilton. Thank you. It was a really small consultancy. We were two guys, but I don't. So just quickly, as an introduction to what Hilton said, we used to be called MIR. We're trying to change the name to make it more appealing. MIR just doesn't really mean anything to anyone. So Power Futures Lab is the name that we're working on at the moment. And as you can see, we're a pretty small team. We do research on 3 main topics, right? So oh yes, sorry. Let me see if this helps. Can you hear me now? No? Yes. Okay. Okay, tell me if it's still a problem. Okay, so we do research on 3 main areas. The political economy of power sector reform, which actually touches a lot on what Hilton was talking about now, these issues around state capture and what has worked and what hasn't worked within Africa. And we've got a PhD student, Katrina Godino, over here that's doing that work. She, by the way, has a similar tattoo as Hilton over here. You can ask him about that later. There's another student from Uganda called Peter. He's doing work on improving utility performance in Africa, and you'll see why that's an important topic now when I rush through my slides. And then power sector investment is where I'm working most of the time, and it's specifically focusing on renewable energy and how that gets procured within Africa and how that enables the investments to happen. So we do that research, and that feeds back into two short courses that we run every year. The one is on power sector reform and regulation in October. That's a week in October that we try and get regulators from the continent to come together to Cape Town and think about these topics. And the second one, which is happening in March now, is really about how do we finance power plants in Africa, and how do you do this in a really risky environment? And so we have a really great lecturer there coming from Yale, Yale and Columbia, where he teaches renewable energy project finance. And then with Anton and myself, and then a number of other practitioners from the legal fraternity and from the banks, etc. And the reason why we do this, and kind of all the work that we do, is to try and be very practical, be able to advocate based on a good understanding of what the core issues are, what for example, makes a power plant work in Nigeria, whereas the same set of issues might not apply in Namibia, and why that is. And so I'm just quickly giving a quick idea where I'm coming from and what we do. So this is the outline of today's presentation. I'm basically boiling down 3 or 4 lectures into less than an hour. So I'm going to rush through, I'm going to dump a lot of data on you and try and just help you understand a lot of issues based on a lot of the data that we have. What I'm going to therefore ask is that you keep your questions just until the end, because I get distracted quite easily and will go down a wormhole and leave everyone else behind. And then, like, before we know, all the time is finished. So, yeah, just a quick note on that. And apologies for if it's going too quickly. If it is too quick, or you want me to just slow down a little bit, just let me know. Okay. So let's quickly. So a big part of this lecture is going to be about just setting the scene, understanding the context, what is happening within sub-Saharan Africa's power sectors. So most of what I'm going to be talking about is happening outside of South Africa. I will bring in South Africa here and there, but mostly it's about the rest of the continent. So there's 4 main challenges, right? The power infrastructure remains underdeveloped. The electricity that is there is often unreliable. Access to that electricity is very low, and power costs are high. I'm going to unpack this quickly for you, just to show you what this looks like. So if you compare global population with installed power generation capacity, you can see that there are massive discrepancies, right? The country like the US has got probably almost 3 times the installed capacity of their population, whereas Africa's the flip side is true. If you look at a place like China, or I mean, it's kind of on an even keel, but if you look at a place like Japan, again, the power systems are much bigger than the populations. And even within Africa, you have a wide discrepancy. So if you look, for example, a country like Nigeria, right, it's got, this is outdated, I think it's probably closer to 180 million people now, but their system is functionally even less than 6 gigawatts. Whereas if you look at South Africa, we've got about maybe closer to 60 million people right now, but our power system has probably got about 50 gigawatts of installed capacity now. And what that means is that what people are able to use is just very little. So you are sitting with Nigeria, as I was talking about now, with a power system that's actually one of the biggest in the continent, right? And basically a dozen countries sit with most of the power generation capacity. I mean, to put this into context, if you took all the power stations in sub-Saharan Africa, all 47 countries, you combine them, you get about, I think, between 90 and 100 gigawatts. If you take out South Africa, you're left with 45. So South Africa represents half of that. If you put it back again, you still have that 90. Spain, one country, Spain has 110 gigawatts of installed capacity. So think about the implication that that has for your economy, for your health sector. How do you run a country without enough electricity? And most African countries have very, very small power systems. Many of them have systems smaller than 100 megawatts, so you can't run a mine on that. So it's a really a severe lack of capacity within the continent, and there's very few economies of scale. Costs go up massively. I'll show you some of the cost drivers now, but just to give you another sense of this. So this line represents the kind of world average power use per capita, or electricity use per capita. So, and you can see in Africa, so these long lines are either North African countries or some of the islands. So like the Reunion Islands, I think Mauritius is over there, South Africa, and Tunisia is kind of right on that line, but everyone else falls way below this line. So Africa is a massive outlier. And another way that this kind of represents itself is just the percentage of firms that are using generators to use as backup. So the blue is the number of firms that have a generator, basically. So you can see like a country like Central African Republic, 80% of firms have a generator. The red is how much of the electricity is actually coming from those generators. So in Chad, 70% of your electricity as a company is being generated by a diesel generator, which is one of the most expensive sources of electricity that you have. So again, all competitiveness is automatically severely impacted by the fact that you just don't have a reliable electricity supply. Okay, another set of slides. This is comparing Sub-Saharan Africa to two other developing regions, so South Asia and East Asia. So if you look at the generation capacity, as we were talking about, how many megawatts are there in the system per million population? Much lower in Sub-Saharan Africa than in South Asia. If you look at the electrification rate, so how many people actually have an electricity connection, again, much lower than South Asia and East Asia. What people can actually use. But then if you look at this graph, this is again a very, very strange graph. We have some of the most expensive electricity in the world. And I'm talking about the Sub-Saharan region now. There's obviously a big range within the continent, but even if you average that out, we have extremely expensive electricity. And I'll show you some of the drivers for that now. So some of it is the fact that a lot of the systems are using oil, so mainly heavy fuel oil or diesel generators to generate their power. Other power systems in the region are mainly hydro-based, which is actually one of the cheapest sources of power. And you can see that there's quite a range, right, in terms of what this does to your cost of power. So the red are systems that are not mainly oil-based, and you can see it's at least half as cheap. Geography plays an important role. So islands obviously have the most expensive power. But countries that are landlocked, which again there are many of in the Sub-Saharan region, pay much more for the electricity. And then the system size plays a massive role. And again, as you saw earlier, so many systems in the region are really small, and you're not able to get those economies of scale that bring those costs down. And then this is further exacerbated by the fact that we often have droughts in the region, and that's even more severe now with climate change. And so, as I said, many systems are mainly based on hydropower. Petroleum prices, as you can see, have been very volatile, leading to massive electricity price shocks. Infrastructure gets damaged through wars. We saw a lot of countries actually lose capacity in their systems, especially during the 90s. And then and the late 80s, and then rapid demand growth it's just outstripping what the system is able to handle. And so all of this kind of combines to give us this picture, right, of continent that's actually still very, very dark when it comes to electricity. And a lot of it, and this is not a problem of technology, as you'll see now, right? This is the technology to solve this problem is really there in most cases. There's one or two things that might still change that could make it easier, but most of this has got to do with other factors, and we're going to explore a little bit of those. I'm just showing you a little bit different picture of what this, just more scientifically, I guess, what this looks like in terms of electricity access. You can see there's like 1, 2, 3, 4 countries that have got relatively good electricity access numbers, and then obviously the North African countries doing really well. But for the rest, the percentage of the population that has access to electricity is very low. So one of the reasons why is just poor performance by utilities. And this is one of the main indicators that one can use to look at how well a utility is run. And it's T&D losses, so it's transmission and distribution losses. Basically, how much of the electricity that gets generated actually ends up with the person that wants to use it, and how much of that is lost over the wires. As you can see, the kind of, not the global, what you want to aim for, and what we're aiming for in South Africa is 10%. So it's okay to lose about 10%, which is still a lot, but you know, and South Africa kind of falls within that range. But if you go up the list, I mean, countries are going all the way up to about 50%. If you think about the fact that you might have a system of 100 megawatts in the Central African Republic, and then 50 megawatts of that just gets lost through the wires. I mean, it doesn't even reach the end consumer. And then someone has to pay for that. And so how do we pay for that? How are we doing with paying for that? So, more bad news. Only 2, actually it's 3. So 3, because they don't include Namibia, but we've got 3 utilities that are solvent, basically. They're financially viable on the continent. So Seychelles, Uganda, and Namibia. The rest, including South Africa, are charging less than they actually need to. And so just to explain this, I think if I remember correctly, because this is now kind of over the legend, but the kind of purple, that shows you operational costs, right? So that usually that's fuel. It might be your coal or the gas or the diesel that goes into your power system. The green is capex, so what it costs to kind of maintain your power systems. And you can see that and the red represents the actual, I just want to check if this, I think it's not the electricity tariff, it's actually what they end up getting in the end. So what the electricity tariff is and what gets brought in in the end can be quite different. But what you can see is most countries actually charge less than it costs them to run that power, just to buy the fuel for their power stations. And there's a deep-seated number of issues around. There's a lot of political economy issues. But the point is that for an investor, if you are wanting to build a power station in most of these countries, you have to sell your power to only one entity, and that's the state utility. But the state utility can't even buy its own fuel. So how are they going to pay you? And so some of these issues, I'll try to unpack a bit more. If you're really very interested in that, you can attend the course in March, because we go into that into quite a lot of depth. Just to show you another way of looking at these kind of losses. So we were talking about what is this loss kind of made up of. So part of it is underpricing. That's kind of the orange part. So just a country not charging enough for its electricity. Part of it is those transmission and distribution losses we were talking about. A big part of it in many countries are bill collection losses. So just not actually getting the money from your customers. And then a very contentious part, and not as big, I think, as many people think, is the issue of overstaffing. And so this is a study where done by the World Bank. It's been relatively controversial. They compared African utilities to pretty well-run utilities in Latin America and kind of use that as a benchmark. But I think as a rule, it shows you that, one, there's a very wide range of utility performance across the continent. But two, that a lot of these issues are kind of prevalent across many countries, and it's not something that's solved very easily. So we have two big interventions that need to be made. The one is to improve the performance of utilities, and there's a range of reasons why. I'm not going to go into those now. And the other is that we need to be able to finance the expansion of the capacity that's in the system, but then also the electrification. In other words, making sure that the electricity that gets built actually then gets to those people that need it. I'm going to focus more on this. This plays into this, as I've explained a little bit now, but this is more of the focus of my presentation. Is everyone still doing okay? Still happy? Okay. So what the response to this problem has been something called the Standard Model of Power Sector Reform that was basically developed by the World Bank, I think about the 80s. What happened is that Chile first unbundled and reformed its power sector, and they did it in a specific way. I'll show you what this looked like. No one knew about it because they speak Spanish and they're far away, as they like to say. And so only when the UK did it, then did people actually pay attention. But this model was, just to note that this model was conceived in an environment where you had full electrification, you had relatively high costs, but you had a big power systems already operating, and what you wanted to do is to make sure that the costs came down. What the World Bank and many others then did is try to use the same approach to tackle many of these issues that we've already spoken about. So you start with this vertically integrated, publicly owned monopoly, like we have in South Africa. You start introducing some commercial discipline. You put an independent regulator in place to provide more transparency and predictability to the industry. You start unbundling those elements of the industry that are competitive, such as generation, from those that are not, such as transmission, which is a natural monopoly. And in that way, you start introducing more private sector participation. And then what you end up is either, so this competition can be either for the market. In other words, you give people long-term contracts with a fixed price for about 20 years, and they build a power station based on that model. Or you can have wholesale competition in the market, where there's the electricity market is trading on a day-to-day or a minute-to-minute basis. And eventually it ends up with retail competition. In other words, you as a consumer can choose whether you buy your electricity from company A or B or C, and they decide where they buy their power from. And so that's a standard model, right? And so you can, this is just another way of showing it. So you've got the vertically integrated monopoly. You move to a single buyer model, which is where you have independent power projects, so private power projects selling to a single buyer that still sells to a vertically integrated system. Then you can start introducing a bit more of a power pool. Your generators can start selling to more than just the single buyer. Maybe they sell to a power pool where bigger customers can buy, such as these. And then eventually you end up with much more competition in the market. So the reality in Africa is that many countries have actually tried this model. Very few have succeeded, and what we've ended up in most places is a hybrid. I think Uganda and Nigeria has probably gone the furthest. And what you see is that the results are also quite varied. So Uganda is doing pretty well, thanks to a lot of the incentives and the way that the power system has been set up. Nigeria, not so much. Nigeria is actually quite a mess at the moment. They've had, I think, 6 or 7 complete failures of their system where everyone lost power. The whole system collapsed in 1 year. And Hilton, if I'm not wrong, but you worked there for quite a while, you probably know that much better than I do, but it is a system that's really struggling at this point to keep going and in large part because this unbundling of their system happened in a very ad hoc way. So I just want to quickly show you then what we are talking about. So you'll see most countries in Africa maintain this vertically integrated model. This kind of second most prevalent model that we are seeing is, so the gray represents the private sector. Is the private sector coming in along the sides, as private power companies, generators, then selling to the vertically integrated monopoly company. And then in a few cases, like I've said, Uganda, you have more unbundling happening. Nigeria, you still have some state-owned generators. But the majority of countries kind of sit within this range. So, okay. So everyone is still happy? You're still with me? Good. Okay. So let's look at what investment has come into the continent. Firstly, let's look at what's needed. So we need much more than is coming into the region at the moment. At least 3 times what was happening in 2015 by 2040. The pace of investment is not enough. So the orange red line down here, that's without South Africa. The blue is including South Africa. You can already see how big a difference South Africa makes to this picture. But I mean, it's a good story. You had very little investment. You basically a lost decade in the 90s, and then it started picking up around the 2000s, and it's been kind of steadily picking up, but it's not nearly quick enough. We're not getting enough power investment into the region. If we break this down into much more kind of granular level for every year, so the blue is IPPs. These are privately financed, owned, operated power plants. The red is other sources. Normally, these would be public sources. So the state would use bonds to raise finance and build power stations for the utility. It still happens. It's about half of the investment, but actually, most of the new capacity in Africa is being built by the Chinese. So that's the orange line you see here. And then the blue line is the private sector, which is what I'm going to focus on more. Part of the reason why I'm not talking more about this is we actually don't know that much about how this works, where it's going. We know a little bit about where it's going, and we know what they're building, but it's a difficult topic. So if any of you know some really good Mandarin-speaking students that want to do a PhD that we will fund, please let me know, because it's a topic we are very keen on unpacking a bit more. But yeah, China is a very big player in Africa right now in the power sector, and it's a key thing to remember. I'm not going to talk that much about what they're doing. What's a little bit misleading about this is that Chinese power projects are actually not that many, and I mean it's about 100 projects, but they're mostly large hydro, so very large, and that they're very good at that. So they can build large hydro quite well. They've got a few coal stations, not that many, quite a lot of gas, some heavy fuel oil, and they're starting to be more active in the renewable space, some wind farms, some renewable energy. I know hydro is also renewable energy, but it's more contentious, especially when it gets quite big. So when I talk about renewables, I'm mostly referring to solar, wind, and some small hydro and other sources. But just to show you, so this just gives you an idea of where some of these Chinese investments have gone. There's this perception that China really only invests in countries where they want the resources. The reality is actually quite different and much more nuanced. We don't really see that pattern being played out. Of course, there are countries, there are these kind of deals, but it's by no means the homogeneous narrative we're being fed. Okay, so that's China. I'm not going to talk about China that much anymore right now. What I'm really interested in is the private sector, how the private sector is able to actually build power projects in Africa in quite risky environments. So what you see, this is kind of showing the year that a project reaches financial close, meaning the year that the the banks and the investors are happy that the project is far along enough that they are they think all the risks have been mitigated. They're happy to put their money into this project. So it's a big milestone. In Africa, it typically takes about 7 years for a project just to reach that milestone. Then you haven't built anything. So we track all IPPs across sub-Saharan Africa, and you'll see these kind of 3 big lumpy periods where a lot of investment came in. This is in, I hope this is in dollars. I'm not exactly sure, but the point being that most of the projects have been actually, again, a few quite big projects for the region. Most of these are thermal power, meaning coal or gas. The exception being Lake Turkana, which is in Kenya, which is a 350 megawatt, I think, wind farm, one of the biggest on the continent. It's a massive wind farm. And so that's been the story of IPP so far in Africa. It's like big projects. It requires a lot of work, lots of people around the table. All the banks need to be talking to each other. All the different stakeholders need to be around the table, and it actually takes a long time for everyone to agree and make sure that the project gets built. This gives you a different view of that, just looking at where the money has gone. So which countries, the darker blue, are the countries that have been able to raise the most money or actually attract the most investment. So you can see Zambia, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal have been quite successful, South Africa obviously as well, and then Uganda and Kenya quite doing quite well in East Africa. Tanzania has a lot of potential, but there's a political situation there that makes it very difficult. If you look at what this looks like in terms of the number of projects, it actually looks a bit different. You see Namibia coming up quite quickly. So this is not looking at the number or the financial flows, but actually just the number of projects. So countries like Namibia and Uganda and also Kenya feature quite strongly in this scenario. And I'll talk a little bit more about this just later, but I just want to kind of mention it to you now. But so why have some countries been able to attract more investment than others? So part of the story is this story of power sector reforms we've been talking about, but it's not the complete story. And actually it's a very, very small part of the story. Much more important is to have a plan, to give predictability, and to make sure that that plan is dynamic, that it gets updated every year, every 2 years, like we have in South Africa, called the Integrated Resource Plan, which is supposed to be updated every, I think, 2 years, but we're still working currently off a 2010 version, to make sure that plan then actually gets translated into procurement, so that you start buying what you said you need to buy, and you start planning and making sure that you have everything in place to be able to buy that in time. And then making sure that there's enough capacity, that, in other words, human resources, enough resources dedicated to your to the procuring entity, but also the utility that is supposed to sign the contract and buy that power at the end of the day. And so competitive procurement has played a big role in bringing in a lot of investment. Competitive procurement and more broadly structured programs, which I will discuss a bit more now. And then DFIs are development finance institutions. These are things like the World Bank or the African Development Bank, KfW, the German Development Bank. These are all playing a really important role. They're able to go into much more risky environments and invest in these projects. Again, so just showing you the darker red are the countries that have been able to attract quite a lot of investment, and the blue, the country is the kind of further along it is in terms of its power sector reform model, measured in a slightly different way than I was talking about earlier. So this is coming from a study that we've done for the African Development Bank, in which we haven't released yet, so don't quote me on this. But generally, you can see that the deeper the reforms are, the more the country is able to attract investment. But there's also this issue of procurement. So there are three ways that you can procure a project. You can just, as a developer, you can start talking to the government saying, we see you need power, we will build it here. Let's start negotiating, and that usually takes a very long time. But that's legitimate way, I think, of doing it. The other way is to have a feed-in tariff. So government saying, we will pay you, for example, say 10 US cents for every unit of energy, every kilowatt hour that you sell us. And if you're willing to accept that, then sign the contract here and go build your power station. So instead of the price of electricity being negotiated, the government decides this is what we will be paying, this is what we can afford, or this is what we think is fair. And then you use that. And this has been the main way that renewable energy has been financed and built in Europe, especially in Germany. I mean, Germany basically pioneered a lot of this. But then the third way is competitive tenders or auctions. This is my passion. It's also my PhD topic, which is very behind. But it's where you tell the private sector or the market basically, we want power, we want, for example, 500 megawatts or 1,000 megawatts or one project, and you have to compete. You have to tell us what price you will sell it at. And so the market, the private sector basically determines the price of electricity. So I just want to quickly show you that there's a very strong relationship between the level of competition that you introduce and the price outcome. So this is looking at our database. So if you look at a medium-speed diesel power plant, you get a much lower cost of electricity. Sorry, ICB means internationally competitive bidding. DN is directly negotiated. So if you introduce competition, you just get a much lower band of pricing. Same is true for renewable energy, so this is solar PV. So feed-in tariffs have been relatively good at tracking the prices, but they still lag behind what you can actually get as a price for your power plant through just introducing competition. Unfortunately, most capacity in the continent is procured in a directly negotiated way. There's a multitude of reasons for this, but it ends up often harming these projects for example, if you as a developer have negotiated this project, you've agreed on a price with the government, but because it's directly negotiated, it's not transparent. There is an election, a change of government, your new government that comes into power say, well, we think this is way too expensive. There's obviously some corruption in this deal. Maybe there was, I don't know. No one knows that because there was no transparency, because there's no competition. And so all of a sudden, your whole investment that's supposed to last you 20 years may all of a sudden be taken away quite quickly, or you have to renegotiate, get a different price. All these things make investors very jittery. And so myself and our unit, we tend to favor internationally competitive bidding. So this excludes South Africa. If we include South Africa's renewables program, which I will talk a little bit more about now, all of a sudden this shoots up quite a lot. Then you have way more capacity being procured competitively. But without South Africa, it's still this story. This story is changing, but it's still the dominant story. This is just looking at it in terms of numbers. So again, to show you, what I actually want to show you is the feed-in tariff. So this is basically two countries, Uganda and Namibia. They've both set two feed-in tariff programs where Uganda procured small hydro plants and some solar photovoltaic projects. And Namibia procured a lot of small-ish solar plants. And the whole discipline of setting up a structured program instead of waiting for the private sector to come to the government one by one is one of the big reasons why these countries have been able to actually rapidly get a lot of investment in a very short time. Before 2016, Namibia had no private participation in its power sector, and now they're one of the biggest destinations. And so the discipline of structuring your program is really important. What's interesting about Namibia is subsequently they ran a competitive tender. They got a much lower price, and now they're not going to do this anymore. And then just this issue I was talking about development finance institutions. You can see, so the orange line is their contribution to the overall investment flows. And the point I want to make is just to show that they kind of tend to track the investment. So whenever there's a power plant being built, there's probably going to be one of these development finance institutions involved, which is a good thing for the investors, because it means usually that if, for example, the World Bank is one of the lenders to this project, and the utility stops paying, or the government is not paying their bills, their monthly electricity bills to this power plant, the World Bank can go to the government and say, look, you've got a whole portfolio of loans. You want to lend more money from us or borrow more money from us. We're not going to do that until you pay your electricity bills. And so just the mere fact of having them at the table is a big risk mitigation option for many of these private power projects. Okay. The reason why I'm talking a lot about private power is because most renewable energy on the continent gets built by the private sector. It's not the public sector that's doing it. And so it's important to understand how they look at this, what the trends are, and how they look at the risks. How's everyone doing? Still all right? Okay. Okay, so let's look at renewable energy a little bit. Okay. So you can see that there was very little happening up until about 2005-06. Very small projects, some pilots here and there. Started picking up around this time. And then this is the time that South Africa ran its renewable energy procurement program. Just again, like this excludes South Africa. So I'm just looking at the rest of the continent. And all of a sudden, the rest of Africa woke up and saw that you can actually buy renewable energy quickly, and you can get it built quickly, and you can, around this time, you can get a really cheap power plant. And so we see investments picking up very rapidly, and this trend is increasing quite quickly. There's a big shift happening, and it's not just in Africa. This is global, right? This is, if you look at the global flows of finance to the electricity sector, most of it is going to renewables. So solar, wind, some large hydro. So nuclear, coal, gas, it's getting very little of any new investment that's happening. And so this is a global phenomenon. It's not just African. Part of this story is about this. So I was talking about auctions or competitive bidding. So these are prices, record-breaking prices that have been coming out in the last year or two. Globally, we're seeing, for example, projects being built in Mexico for 1.8 US cents. That's for wind. 2 US cents for solar photovoltaics. That's extremely low. I think Eskom's average cost of supply at this stage is around 6 US cents, right? So think about what that means for a power system. All of a sudden, your cheapest source of power is now renewable. And that has massive implications, which I'm going to run through with you now. But I just want to show you, like, it's happening all over. Most of it is actually happening in the developing world. Africa, but also especially Latin America, South Asia. A lot of the Middle Eastern countries are getting extremely good prices. Obviously, they have good resources and cheap finance, but there's a big shift happening. And so what we are seeing, basically what this just shows you is that most renewable energy that's going to get built. So we know most new electricity sector investment is going to come, is going to go to renewables, and most of that is going to be going to projects where the prices are being set competitively. And the reason for that is this price pressure that we've been seeing. So the green or the price ranges of projects that have been set by auctions or competitive tenders. Red is feed-in tariffs, and then other types of mechanisms are all in gray. And it just shows you that auctions is really kind of leading for basically helping the procurers to understand what is the real cost of renewable energy now, and being able to actually secure that. This is data from the World Bank. This is our own data, where we've just been tracking auctions from, I think, 2015. Yeah. So it just again shows you this very, very quick decrease in prices. So that was for solar, and this is for wind, and it's from across the world. And again, this record-breaking prices. Okay, my thing is going automatically. I don't know why. But the result has been that within Africa, we're seeing lots of countries, at last count, I think it was about 21, 22, starting their own auction programs now. So South Africa was the leader. So the dark blue are countries where the projects that have been procured have actually reached financial close. Stop doing that. So you see it's still a handful of countries that have been able to actually get projects across that finish line. But there's a lot of intent, good intent. But like Ethiopia, for example, they announced their winners about a year or two ago. They still haven't been able to just get financial close on these projects, never mind getting them built. So auctions help a country address some of the issues that are impeding investment, but there's still a large number of other fundamentals that need to be addressed. What's good about a good auction design is that it actually, a good auction thinks about all of these issues and tries to address them even before going to market. I won't bore you with that now, but that's a topic I can talk about a long time. This is just giving you a bit more detail on what has been procured. So South Africa, we've procured about 6,300 megawatts of renewable energy, different resources, wind, solar, biomass, biogas, everything. But there's a wide variation in how countries approach their different tender programs. So some countries, for example, want a lot of local content. Like South Africa, we want to build up our local industry. Other countries like Uganda and Zambia, they're not really worried about that. Some countries, very, very understandably, are really worried about where this project will be built. Is it going to be built close enough to the grid? And will it be built where the power is actually needed? Because, like in South Africa, for example, most of our solar resources are sitting in the Northern Cape, but there's not a lot of load in that region. So if your power system is only 100 megawatts or 500 megawatts, you want to make sure that any new capacity that you build is actually being built where the grid can take it and where it's needed. And so you see a lot of government either selecting this site or providing a lot of guidance or restrictions to the private sector about where they can build these. The only thing I wanted to show you is that we're still seeing a wide range in the prices that are coming out of these projects. So Uganda was the first country outside of South Africa to run an auction. They got a really quite expensive projects at that stage. Then Zambia ran an auction. They got a really good price. No one saw that coming. Ghana still haven't built this project, and it's quite inexpensive. It's a South African company that won that. And then Namibia, again, got the same price as Zambia. And a lot of people were very critical of the Zambian project. They were saying there has to be some way that they kind of tricked us into, not us, but the private sector into saying like this, you can actually build a plant for that price in Zambia. But then Namibia did the same, and they actually had less government support, less support in terms of the currency than Zambia, and they got the same price. And so generally this trend is downwards, but it depends really on how well this program is set up and designed. Just to show you what's happened in South Africa. So the green is solar PV, the red is wind. So these are the prices that have been bid in, the average prices over the different procurement rounds. The blue is the average cost that Eskom is selling electricity at, I think, to municipalities. So this is not the cost at the power plant, and it's not the cost at the household level, but it's kind of the Megaflex tariff. And the point I just want to make is that threshold has been crossed already in 2015, and we are probably if we're going to run a new round of procurement, which government as apparently said they will do this year, we are probably going to see renewable energy plants coming in at the second threshold, which is at prices below Eskom's most expensive coal plants. And so it's going to make more sense for Eskom to start shutting down those expensive coal plants than to keep on running them. And this is completely changing the landscape of our power sector. This is just another way of showing it. So that's kind of talking about what is existing. But if we have to build anything new now, you can see that renewables, so solar and wind, is much cheaper than anything else. Now, this doesn't, and clear, I have to say, this doesn't include the price of, for example, gas. So if you need the system to run for 24 hours, you need to be able to meet the variability of renewables with the power source that's able to ramp up and down quite quickly. But even in that scenario, when you add gas to solar PV, and the ERC has been doing incredible modeling around this, which you can see here. You can see that the cheapest new build option for our country is going to be wind, which is blue, and solar, which is yellow, and then some gas, which is the purple. And so the coal sector is facing a massive decline, and we have to be very, very cognizant of that. We have to think about what are the implications for the communities that are affected by this. In Mpumalanga, for example, where a lot of these coal plants are situated, where the mines are situated, how do we make sure that this doesn't end up becoming a massive disruption and disaster for those communities? And it's possible. Countries like Spain and Australia, they've been thinking about this a lot. They've been working with the unions to come up with plans that are feasible, that will help to lessen this impact. But the point is the entire structure of South Africa's electricity sector, if you look at it on a least cost basis, is going to be renewables based. And this is the South African picture, but it's also the picture for the rest of the continent. And it's a global picture. So this just shows you quickly. This is from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which is probably the most reliable of all these kind of global energy analysis firms. And so this is where we are, more or less, right? And you can see we're at the kind of starting point of a global shift in the power system, and we can try and predict what is going to happen and how to build up our systems to be able to use these variable resources, how to change our power markets to work with these. But I think before we even talk about that, it's just important to realize that everything is changing very rapidly. And yeah, this is the same picture for South Africa. It's the same picture in many African countries. So I'm just going to conclude with a few slides on the future. How do we think about the future? So this is Denmark. If you look at Denmark in the 1980s, they had a few centralized power plants. If you look at Denmark in 2005, the country is full of decentralized power. Lots of wind turbines, lots of other decentralized plants, lots of solar heating, even in Denmark, which doesn't have good solar resources. And if you look at South Africa, we're starting to see the same picture. Right, this is 2011, before the renewables program began. We had basically lots of coal up here. We had Koeberg down here, a few peaking plants. But all of a sudden, the entire geography of our electricity system is changing very rapidly. And it has lots of implications for how we use land, how we think about our transmission system, and again, how we think about how these affected communities can be integrated. So that's the one thing. The system is changing. It's becoming much more decentralized. And with that we're seeing the need for data and for information and being able to use information technology much more. So this is Eskom's National Control Center in Germiston, where they control the entire grid. This is the control center for Scatec. They're a Norwegian company, or at least originally they started in Norway. They came to South Africa through our renewables program, and through the program they've now become, they kind of use it as a launching pad. They're one of the top 10 global solar developers in the world. They're running their entire global portfolio from their Cape Town office. 95% of their staff in that office are South Africans. And they've got this center, and this center is linked up. And from this center they can control everything within their power plants, up to a string of PV panels. They can see exactly what's going on, what's going wrong. And this kind of granularity of information and data is going to become much more prevalent, and it's important for us to be able to build this power system of the future to be able to work in a way that's much more geared for this. Other issue, I just wanted to quickly show you, maybe you've heard of this already, this is called the duck curve, just because it kind of looks like a duck. But it shows what's happening in California. And you're seeing this, so this is the demand for electricity during the day. So this is starting at like 12 and 9 in the evening. So you see it kind of, in 2012, it was still like that. You know, like relatively you can, it's okay. It's smoothish. And what happened here is people started putting lots of solar on their roofs. And as they do that, as the sun is shining, you just use less and less and less electricity.